Hello, welcome to Transformation in 10. I want to talk to you today about how to successfully overcome discouragement. Listen, how do you know somebody needs encouragement? How do you know you need encouragement? You know how? You're breathing. The truth is, we all have battles at times with discouragement. As believers, followers of Jesus, people who are invested in a relationship with God, we're no different. We have great times, great seasons. We also have challenging times, challenging seasons. And so discouragement is a reality that you deal with, I deal with, everybody deals with, and the scriptures are very clear about this. One of the things, and you've heard me say this before, one of the things I really love about the Word of God is that it doesn't deny reality. It gives us the good, the bad, and the ugly of human experience. We see this a lot in the personal journeys and the stories of the great men and women of God who He used to do great things through. There are heroes, as it is, that Hebrews 11 Heroes Hall of Fame, and yet every one of them had to deal with discouragement. So maybe that's a relevant, timely topic for you right now in your life. Maybe it's not. But regardless of what season you're in, discouragement is something you've already known, and you're probably going to have to deal with at some point in the future again. So let's take a couple of minutes to talk about it. Now, for me, one of my greatest biblical heroes is King David. But not just when he became king, but from the time God called him to be a king when he's a teenage boy. I love his story because I see so many dynamic things that David overcame. And in 1 Samuel 30, he's got a real battle with discouragement when the Amalekites destroy his town of Ziklag, and he and his men come back to find their city wasted, their families and their children and their possessions taken hostage, and they're gone. And it looks hopeless. You see, the thing about discouragement is that it can make us feel hopeless. Hopelessness, if it doesn't get overcome and dealt with successfully, can lead us down a pathway to despair. And in that scenario, the scriptures paint clearly that this great, mighty, incredible man of God and these incredible 600-man team of warriors, that the scriptures actually called them mighty men. Yet they came to a level of discouragement because of what had happened to them. And so the discouragement gave way to hopelessness that just became a toxic mix of despair. Frankly, when they talk about killing him, I mean, there's a total societal breakdown in that moment of their internal and external hope. They lose internal hope and they're internally discouraged and now despairing because they see no external sign of hope. So discouragement can come from a number of factors. Number one, it can be circumstantial. Sometimes we're battling discouragement because our circumstances are throwing all kinds of stuff at us. And we get overwhelmed. And when we don't see signs of hope, or we don't see options and pathways to overcoming what it is we're dealing with in our circumstances, we can get to a place of deep discouragement. So number one, sometimes discouragement is circumstantial. You see, it's important to know why you're discouraged because that's going to determine the strategy you're going to use to overcome it. You see, the truth is discouragement can be overcome, and we'll talk about that in a minute because David did something strategic where he relied on his relationship with the Lord. When he had nobody else to turn to, nowhere else to go, no signs of hope, he tapped into encouragement, and it helped him to battle back and bounce back quite powerfully from the discouragement he was feeling. So number one, circumstances. Number two, it could be unmet expectations. If we have unmet expectations, unmet desires, or unmet needs, we will become discouraged. Now, maybe not in the beginning, but anything that goes unmet over time will empty us, and then we become susceptible to discouragement. And the longer we're discouraged, the deeper the discouragement gets, and it can move us, if we're not careful, into hopelessness, despair, or even depression. So there are external reasons for discouragement. Those are circumstances, situations, stresses that we're dealing with externally in our lives. Internal discouragement is the result of unmet expectation, unmet desire, unmet need. If I were going to take a deep dive in terms of the expectation angle, I would talk about the fact that sometimes our expectations aren't met because they're unrealistic. Maybe the expectation in general is unrealistic, and we haven't thought it through, and we have exaggerated expectations. Or maybe the time frame for the expectation to be realized is not as quick as we were expecting it would. So when we have unmet expectations, we become discouraged. So unmet expectation, unmet desire, something you want, hope deferred makes the heart sick. Proverbs chapter 13, verse 12. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. That's desire delayed, desire prolonged. Need. We have needs. You have physical needs, emotional needs, spiritual needs, relationship needs. God made us to need Him and to need other people. And when the needs in our lives go unmet, it leads us down a path of discouragement. So those are just two quick examples. External circumstances, internal expectations, desires, or needs that are unmet that can lead us to discouragement. Number 3 is unanswered prayer. I don't think I need to unpack that. You know probably what that's like. Or watch this, the perception of unanswered prayer. Maybe God is not saying no, but maybe saying not yet. And we misinterpret the not yet for no, and we feel like the prayer has gone unanswered. And so we're discouraged by that. So 3 things: external, internal, and feeling disappointed because of something in our relationship with God relating to unanswered prayer. So those 3 things can lead us to a path of discouragement. So David did something that is so important in dealing with his discouragement. And the Bible said that when he had nowhere else to turn externally, he can't turn to a friend, he can't turn to a circumstance, he doesn't have a door that he can walk through. It looks like externally, nothing good can come out of this. Yet the Bible said David encouraged. That's inside courage. Courage from the inside out. Everything in our life, and it's so important to grasp this, God designed us to live from the inside out. Outcomes are the result of ideas, passions, visions, and dreams that take place inside before they happen outside. So it's about what's going on inside of us. So David had learned by his history with God that he could lean on the Lord to find what he needed in terms of recovering his focus, rebooting his courage, and reigniting his thinking, his believing, and his behaving that would move him from discouragement to encouragement. See, the opposite of the discouragement is encouragement. You're either empty or you're full. You either have courage or you don't. And discouragement means I'm empty in my courage because of one of those 3 things that I talked about a minute ago. So you're either encouraged or discouraged. David shifted that by leaning on his relationship with God. So I want to ask you a question. What has your personal history, your personal journey with Jesus taught you about him? See, that's faith, but it's also a strategy, because David employed a strategy that successfully empowered him to move from deep discouragement. In fact, he'd gone from discouragement to despair because the Bible said he was exceedingly stressed, or literally meaning to be excessively squeezed. He's feeling a level of pressure that those other men weren't feeling because they've all turned against him. They could have relied on one another, but David now has nowhere else to go externally. And so he's intentional about using the strategy of revisiting his history with God and trusting on that. What has your personal journey with Jesus taught you about your reliability factor with him? You see, that's the starting point. That's step number one. When you're battling discouragement and you want to overcome it, you've got to be intentional about step number one, revisiting your personal history with the Lord and extracting lessons. Go back to that wisdom. What has your journey taught you about him? Because that becomes now a building block that you use to begin to build your way back from discouragement to encouragement, from empty to full, from directionless to clarity, from hopelessness to hope, from chaos to peace, from being stuck to moving forward. So David first encourages himself in the Lord his God. He revisits his personal history. Number two, he begins the process of giving himself permission to dream, permission to think in terms of possibilities and outcomes. He dares to dream that it's not over. Number one, he revisits his personal history with God to extract lessons out of that and gain wisdom that he can get clear on as a building block to move from discouragement to encouragement. The next thing he does is he begins to give himself permission to dream in spite of the context and the conditions that had made him discouraged. You see, if you'll show me your focus, I'll show you your future. What are you focused on? David relied upon his personal history with the Lord to shift his focus. And somewhere in that mix, you've got to be willing to take a step of courage to give yourself permission to dream again and to do the work necessary to close out, shut out those thoughts that tell you it's hopeless. There's no possibility here. David refused to engage that thinking. That's step number three. You've got to focus on what you can do, not focus on what has created the discouragement. As long as you're focused on what made you discouraged, you're going to stay discouraged. And not only will you remain discouraged, you'll go into a deeper state of discouragement that can end up in a place of despair, hopelessness, and depression where you give up, where you quit. Let me ask you this. What would have happened to David's men and their families? What would have happened to their futures? What would have happened to those children who were taken hostage if David had quit? Again, let me remind you, he doesn't have anybody believing with him, praying with him, agreeing with him, nobody to go get a cup of coffee with and sit down and work things through and talk things out, and no fellowship other than relying on his history with God. What if he had quit? What if you quit? What's going to happen if you quit? You need to ask yourself that question. Instead of saying, there's nothing I can do, you start focusing on what I can do. So David has the idea, this is what I can do. I can go to God about this. He doesn't have a word from God when this is going on, but he has the idea and he focuses on what he can do, and then he focuses on what works. You see, when we get discouraged, a lot of times we become focused on what isn't working. This isn't working. That didn't work out. You've got to shift your focus from what hasn't worked or what isn't working to what is. So I want to ask you right now, with everything that's going on in your life, what's the at least one thing that you can identify that works? And what you do, once you've identified, you work that for everything you've got. Pour everything, invest everything in the one thing that works. Many things may not be working, but you can't let that crowd out your focus. You got to focus on the one thing. If all you've got is one thing that's working right now in your life, for David, That was his relationship with God. Nothing else was working. Every other relationship at that moment had had a devastating breakdown. He couldn't rely on it. He couldn't lean on it. So he focused on what worked. Focus on what works. And it's out of that that he began to hear from God and lay a path forward. Now, the final step. Train your brain, your heart, and your emotions, your mind and your emotions, to focus forward. What can I do? What's working? And focus forward means, how can I use that? How can I do something with it to move forward? Because as you move forward, you begin to come out. You climb your way out. You build your way back out of the state of discouragement you're in. You see, external circumstances are going to change. Seasons change. You've got to change inside if you're going to create change outside. David does this by strategy. He leaned on his personal history with the Lord. He focused on what worked. He focused on what he could do. He gave himself permission to dream again, and finally, he used all that to focus forward, to move beyond the place where he and his men had been devastated by disappointment. I promise you, when you find yourself battling disappointment, if you'll employ these strategies, I'm going to give them to you again and I'm done. Rely on or revisit your personal history with the Lord. And be intentional about identifying the wisdom and lessons that you've learned from that are building blocks to hope. Give yourself permission to dream. Focus on what you can do. Focus on what works. Focus on moving forward. How you can take all of that information, all of that insight, revelation, and begin working it in a pathway that moves you in the direction you want to go. You see, ultimately, the bigger roadblock to encouragement is not the external disappointments you're dealing with. It's the internal disappointments that are battling you. David's experience in 1 Samuel 30 is a 5-step master strategy to overcoming disappointment, discouragement, to beating discouragement so that it can't beat you, and for moving forward and experiencing what a God comeback looks in your life. I pray today for you that the Spirit of God will take this time together and download fresh understanding and insights as it relates to your personal journey, your personal destiny, and your personal struggle with discouragement. And may He give you keys that move you forward and break you into a brand new season of experiencing forward movement in your life.